All right, we're recording. It's August 2. We've got lots going on for Gateway API, and hopefully we're getting awfully close to V1 Alpha 2 being ready. I created this kind of makeshift table here just to track where we are with all these different gaps. I think there's kind of an invisible line here where I guess it's not really invisible, but in my mind, this is a nice to have, but certainly not necessary in any way. So we really need to be focusing on getting everything here and above in the next ideally week or so. Nick had a PR for reference policy that implements it. I think a few of us have already left some feedback on it. So thank you to everyone that has. This feels pretty close. I think everything in here is primarily nitpicks and not nothing that we need to spend much time discussing here. I think in most cases, the implementations of get should be pretty straightforward. It's more just typos or other, small things. So I don't think we need to spend too much time on this, just a heads up that it exists. And if you have any opinions, get them in. Otherwise, hopefully we can get merged in pretty quickly. For policy attachment, there were two PRs. One, I separated the removal of backend policy. That one is in, merged, good to go. The other one is really just a docs PR, almost entirely a docs PR that describes how policy attachment should work. I've had some feedback on this one, but if anyone has time to take another run through this, I would be helpful. Feels like we're awfully close again. This is really just translating components of the gap into either docs or Go types. And hopefully what we already had in the gap was pretty close. What I'm more concerned about is, so backend ref, I think this one is also very close. I added a bit of feedback just before the meeting, so sorry for the late notice on this one, Harry, but I added a suggestion to rename this to backend ref. We've kind of gone in circles around the naming here, but it looks like the API conventions strongly prefer or require that ref suffix, but otherwise looks great.
Sounds good. I'll update that I'll update that later tonight. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. 725. This one is massive. Thank you. I know most everyone has at least done initial, or I guess not quite everyone, but we've had an initial round of review from a lot of people on this and discussed it last week in more detail and in the week before that. So I don't want to spend too much time discussing this again, but I just want to, this feels like the one that we're furthest away from consensus on. And I'm not saying that that's that far away. It's just the other ones are just, like one nitpick away from an LGTM approve and go forward. This one feels like there's still some broader questions on it. I wanted to kind of give one last opportunity. Like most of the comments on here are, oh, thank you, are of the small nature, like nothing groundbreaking, nothing saying we should do something like entirely different for this. But I want to give anyone an opportunity. Like, is this an approach that feels too extreme? Should we be looking at a different approach, or is this conceptually the direction that we're comfortable with for this change? Any kind of hesitation as far as the big picture direction here?
I don't know if I left that comment or not, but I think overall, I think this is in the right direction. It is a narrower API than the previous one, so we could again extend it if needed. It would introduce some hassle, but I think it can be done. So that's good. Overall, I think the easy path becomes a slightly, or it becomes more complicated. So that's that's one thing that I think I personally don't like, but I also don't see another option to balance, how to balance security and user friendliness here. So, but overall, yeah, a +1.
So we're planning to keep the selection from the gateway as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a confusing part of this gap. What I be and a confusing part of what exists right now. Planning on keeping everything but the namespace, sorry, the route selector on gateway. So there will still be a namespace selector on gateway pointing down towards routes, but the actual route selection is something that I think provides very little value and adds a great deal of confusion.
So the namespace selection will just be has the kind and the namespace. So the
Yeah.
route selection will now be down to kind and namespace.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I trust.
There's kind of a couple of cross-cutting issues here that are sort of related and make things a little bit fuzzy. First is the need to put multiple kinds of routes on the same listener.
Yeah.
So I guess the way you'd have to do that now would be the way that was suggested in the PR originally, which is you depend on the listeners being collapsed. Right? You have multiple listeners on the same ports, and each one selects a different kind of route, and then your implementation collapses those down. The other thing that I think is maybe worth discussing a little bit is how this interacts with the reference policy. So I pinged Nick on Slack, and I think one of the useful things you could almost do with reference policy is if you're a gateway owner, you could if you're a gateway owner, you could say this specific gateway object can receive these kinds from namespace A, and this other gateway object can receive kinds from namespace B. And to do that, we've kind of split the policy across reference policy and gateway, because reference policy can't specify an object by name. And so you have to specify the kind and the namespace in the listener of the object. So it's a little bit, it's just the policies are spread across two objects, which feels a little bit awkward.
I think I missed the last part of that. So you're right that reference policy is a little bit more broad in how it actually before I go into that, let me there were two parts, and the first part was the kinds, the how gateway selection can support multiple kinds. This is something that one of it may have been actually a discussion with you, James, I'm not sure, but one of the initial bits of feedback pointed to an issue where there was more discussion on maybe we should make this the time where we support multiple kinds per listener, because this is no longer a concept of selection. This is no longer a concept of select, an implementation doing some kind of query informer list, whatever, of this kind, of this, whatever. So supporting multiple kinds becomes maybe marginally more sensible in this approach. There's some good feedback from Harry that maybe we still need to make this a required and explicit list, which I can get behind. But the fundamental idea, I think, of this, it helps with your first point, that it does become slightly easier to handle multiple kinds per listener. So maybe, yeah, let's start with that discussion. Does this approach generally make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. But I think that I guess it's not something that you couldn't have done before,
Yeah,
because you can always have a different kind on a different listener on the same port and collapse those down.
yeah, you're right. And it's also not something that is entirely reliant on this change of, the routes directly referencing. Yeah, so you're right. What I think makes it a little bit more amenable now is that it's very clear that the route is opting into being attached to the gateway or desires to be attached to a gateway. Whereas if you make a selector too broad, I select all routes. It would be possible to select all routes of all kinds and bind them to a listener. And that, I think, would be very confusing. And anyway, so I think this is slightly better now, but I agree it was possible before if you did collapsing listeners. I think your later point was probably more important here, or larger in scope, and that was how this interacts with reference policy, right? And you had some concerns like reference policy, as you mentioned, does not support a reference by name, right? You say, I trust resources of this type in this namespace to be able to reference resources of this type in my namespace. And this is a slightly different model than that. It's similar. You're saying from the gateway side, you're saying, I trust resources of these kinds in these namespaces to be able to attach to me. So it seems pretty similar to me, but I think you had pointed out some larger differences that I might have missed.
Yeah, so I think the question is that the policy you're trying to implement is now split across two places. Like you have one thing which is called reference policy, but to make the reference policy specific in a way that seems like a reasonable practice, you actually need to augment it with the gateway, which kind of implies that the reference policy API isn't specific enough or isn't quite complete, right? You can't express the policy for this use case using reference policy. You need more.
That's fair. And I mean, you can, but it just gets very messy, as I show in the alternatives, that you need so much more. It becomes very verbose to express this with reference policy. I think the fundamental flaw or concern of reference policy is, and interacting with gateway is just that gateway has listeners and everything on the listener is about, it is really about that level of trust or whatever per listener. Each listener would likely trust a different set of namespaces and potentially even a different set of route types. So given that, I feel like there's ways you could extend reference policy to make it work for gateway, but as the alternatives show, I think it is rather messy and verbose, and we could try and force reference policy to handle this. I don't know that it makes sense. One thing we could say in the future is that you could choose to say, use reference policy to trust. No, this is a bad idea, but you could theoretically say reference policy can be used to to allow cross namespace references to the gateway as a whole instead of per listener. But I think that's overly confusing and messy and not anywhere we want to go.
I mean, think about a very complex, sorry to interrupt you. So think about a very complex organization where they want to separate like trust relationship. And the only way you can solve with RBAC in Kubernetes is to have two different resources there. So if a custom implementation wants to do that, probably nothing is preventing them to do that.
Yeah, I think my take on reference policy for gateway is that the gateway route relationship is by far the most common one that gets used. And in most organizations we've seen, there's relatively few gateways, or there's like a gateway. It's either relatively a small pool of gateways or a gateway per tenant, such that it doesn't to centralize the policy makes it more complex to do something that's very common, which to me, it feels like it's adding too much verbosity to do something that a lot of users will have to do, and they'll have to get to know a new resource, which makes, I think, which warrants it for the more unique use cases, like route inclusion, secret references, and things like that. But I don't know, it feels like a bit too much for the gateway route relationship.
Yeah, I think Rob's point about, this binding being, or the scoping being per listener also kind of complicates the idea about putting it directly into reference policy too, because then we have to go, take on the same complexity that we did for the other PR when we start talking about section names and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so that's what led me to the current proposal. It seems like we're pretty close here, but I know there's some recent feedback I need to follow up on. But if there are, and actually some poor indentation too, but if there are any other things that come up that you're in any way hesitant about, definitely ping me or add it to add feedback on the PR, whatever. But I would love to get this in soon. I would certainly love to get this in this week. I'll plan on updating this PR based on the feedback today, later today, like after this meeting. But otherwise, I hope we're pretty close here. Having this discussion makes me think that, and the discussion in previous meetings makes me think that this is probably a reasonable way. I don't think it has its flaws, but I think it's probably the least bad of our options right now. And it leaves us lots of room to expand in the future if we need to add more capabilities. Yeah. Okay, any last comments on this before I keep on going? Oh, actually, I see Harry added a comment in chat that I missed. That reference policy is more of an extension point and not a core feature. I do believe we've considered reference policy extended. Need to triple check on that. But there's a very small list of exceptions for when you might not want to support it. And it's, I forget exactly how it's defined in the GAP and Nick's more recent PR. But although it's extended, I think it's something that, yeah, as you said, is core-ish. It is core with a few exceptions. Does that line up?
Yep.
Okay.
It's in the gap, right? Like it's very specific.
Yeah.
Rob.
Yeah. And I need to double check that Nick's PR also covers that, but I would assume it does. Cool. All right, well, I'll skip over the redirect and rewrite one here. That's 727. There's been some good feedback and discussion here, but since, if there's time, I'll come back to it, but I want to make sure we can get to V1 Alpha 2 first and some PR and issue triage as well. For V1 Alpha 2, I spent some time looking through the milestone, and if you look at it, you can say, oh, wow, this looks rather overwhelming, and that would be accurate. But if you look at this long list, of those issues, 3 of them are not covered by gaps. So the vast, and that's my math. Feel free to add additional ones that I may have missed. But from what I can find, there are three things that we need to cover outside of this work on GEPs. So if you boil it down to that, it feels like we're maybe not as far away as it may seem. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Documenting the supported Kubernetes version seems easy enough, just something that we need to do.
Is there anything that prevents us from just 16 plus? Do people know?
Yeah, so one of the things when I removed the backend policy concept, resource, whatever, we had one, that was one way we got around app protocol not being a thing. And that only exists in 118 or 119. So if you want that specific thing, then you need this version or newer.
But 116 is like basically obsolete at this point anyways. It's kind of not a big deal.
Yeah, and that was the argument when we removed backend policy, that any replacement would be rather complex, and focusing on something that is really only relevant for, 118 and below, it seems like a poor use of time. So yeah. This seems easy. If anyone wants to volunteer for this, this is I think a straightforward one to write up. Basically, 99% of features. This API works for 116 plus. There are some features currently limited to app protocol that will require 118 or 119. Well, will require this to be in your Kubernetes cluster. I can't think of any other exceptions. And another one, this is an older one.
Anyone on the call interested in taking it?
Yeah.
I'll do it since I opened the issue.
Yeah, it should be a brief, it's like one sentence almost.
Oh, actually, it looks like Jimin, you volunteered in chat. If you're,
yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that would be awesome. If you're able, happy to help out in any way. But yeah, we'd love additional contributors here. Thanks.
Sure.
Then there's 213. There's been some more recent discussion on this one around header value, matching multiple header values. This one, I think we're pretty close here. Let's see. I think we just need someone to actually document what we expect to happen here. Envoy had some weird almost buggy behavior before here and how it did header matching. But it seems like most others are going to do the comma separated value for header matching. Is that correct? James, it looks like you're the last person to comment here. Does that match what you're understanding?
I think in Envoy, you need to, I think the Envoy behavior is it coalesces everything into a single comma separated string, and you have to regex match. I think is
right
what you do in Envoy.
But isn't that just the RFC? Like, isn't that just standard behavior? And it was more of a bug that our Envoy didn't do that to begin with?
No, that you're not, as far as so my reading of the standard is you're not required to do that. You can, it's a may. You may combine multiple fields with the same name into one comma separated field, but you don't have to.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, the RFC, I think it permits you having like the same header name can be repeated multiple times in a response, and then the ordering is also important.
Yeah, these are if the header is defined as a list header. So you kind of have to know about I think you have to know about specific headers which have list semantics. Which
it looks like it's like you shouldn't do this, except for these list of things that we made an oopsie with. It seems like.
So is this like, do people actually use this for a matching criteria at all? Like, should we be spending time on this? Is what I'm thinking.
I've never
So
heard of anyone
We should
doing
kind
this
of
personally.
defer to, for example, is forwarded a comma separated field? Like we should just, ideally, we would just basically like look at the RFC, like,
Yeah,
And I
forwarded
think-
is comma separated because you append, you add a field, you add a field value for each hop.
right, but I think it makes sense that that comes into, as I recall, most proxy implementations give that to you as a comma separated list rather than calling you n times with the same header. Like I haven't, I think that is kind of what the expectation is.
So then if that's
Eh,
true, then you would, for list valued headers, you would be required to use a regex match. Is that what we're kind of saying?
I think so, because it's otherwise you're kind of, because you can, let's say the user is doing what you have here in the top of the screen, which is foo bar baz. The sender could be sending it to you in foo comma bar comma baz or foo then bar then baz, right? And it's, if we say that there's a distinction between the two, that feels weird because the meaning of those two things should be the same.
Yeah, so that, yeah, so RFC speak is that the meaning of those two things is the same. I guess the question here is, what are our requirements on the header matching API? And it sounds like what you're saying is we want to make the requirements that the proxy, that the header matching implementation normalizes everything to comma separated values.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think like it's okay to say, I'm assuming that the proxy implementations, some people might have gotten it wrong. But we should just note that we expect, yeah, we'd have to test, like, if people know proxy, I'm assuming most proxy implementations actually do what Envoy did. I think Nginx actually does what Envoy does.
I feel like this is something that's kind of weird to say, you have to behave this way, because the reality is that every implementation of this API is building on existing proxies, at least today. Like there's no gateway API ground up purpose-built proxy. And I feel like everyone's just going to use what the underlying proxy does. Like, I don't care what the spec says. I'm probably not going to go change Envoy so that I can match a different way if it doesn't go the way the spec does. Right.
Yeah, that's kind of the sentiment I'm looking for, is like, we'll just reference the spec, but if you behave differently, it's like, that's actually kind of a bug for the proxy.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of applies to a lot of fields too. The more specific we get about matching, like in some ways it's good because we want to be specific. But on the other hand, because we're not using purpose-built implementations of this, a lot of times it makes it so that you can't actually implement the API in accordance to the spec. So I feel like it's tricky.
But I think this one is fairly clear, like, that proxies should behave a certain way. It's just that it's probably like an edge case that people aren't cognizant of when they implemented it.
yeah, that makes sense. It looks like we're pretty clear on what to do next. Does anyone want to volunteer to own this and create just a small update in the Go docs as far for header matching here?
I can update this, unless James, you want to.
No, I'm happy for you to do that, Bowie.
Okay, you can comment on my PR.
Perfect. Awesome, thanks. All right, and the one last one we currently have in the V1 Alpha 2 milestone is this one, TLS spec on route. And TLS on route is something that I think we've gone around in circles on. And before I go too far into this discussion, I want to ask more broadly of different, implementations out there. How critical of a use case is this? Is this something that is a very important to you? I know this is something that came up earlier, very early in the design, and I'm trying to understand the stories for it more, just so when we're framing this discussion, we're framing it properly and translating the use case into something that actually makes sense. So anyone who is really, either already using or supporting this feature or has users that want this.
I know of some users who have asked for this in Kong, and then there is also like, I don't have issues at hand, but I think the Ingress Nginx project also has had, some contributors asking for this because this leads to with Ingress spec, it leads to problem. With Gateway API, maybe that's not a problem. So that's how I read that.
With Ingress spec, what is a problem? Just the merging of certs and different ingresses?
Yeah, so with Ingress spec, you could have like, two different namespaces or two different Ingress resources, no matter where they live. And they could have like foo.example.com and specify a TLS cert for them for that host name. And what happens if, that host name is different? So that's like one problem. And then the second issue that comes up a lot with, Gateway API simplifies that, right? So if you do host name and TLS cert at the listener level, then you're good. So, so with that case, it's fine. I know I took an objection here. It was just to make sure that we move it to extended for reasons we understand. That's all.
Thought I was unmuted. Sorry. I agree, and I think before we get into discussion around whether or not this should be extended, I wanted to understand. Like I know there's some concerns about how this is implemented, how safe it is, and other things. But before I went there, I wanted to properly understand the use cases here. It sounds like, the bring your own domain kind of thing. Micaiah, I think there was a Red Hat. I'm not sure if you're still on there was a Red Hat specific use case for this. Does that sound familiar? Is this something that would be valuable to your users?
I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand exactly what this PR is describing.
Oh, sorry. So this is the ability to define a certificate on a route, on HTTP route, that can be attached to a gateway. So it is essentially saying that there is another way to attach certificates that is not tied to a gateway. So non-gateway admins can provide their own certificates if the gateway admin allows them to.
Okay, right. Yes, we do have a use case for that. We want users to be able to supply the certificate.
Okay, so, and in that case, it's some kind of central multi-tenant gateway, and you want different users to be able to provide a certificate per listener. Is that accurate?
Not per listener necessarily.
Okay.
Per route.
Per route.
Well,
okay.
per host name.
Per host name. So, okay. But so yeah, this gets into kind of the tricky bits of how this is implemented and documented. And right now, I think it's a little bit confusing. So a lot of this there is the bit at the end about potentially changing this to extended support. And I think that's a larger discussion, which it would first be good to understand use cases before and understanding of interpretation here before we go too far into support level. But to clarify here, and this is like a key point, when you're attaching a certificate from a route, is it acceptable that that certificate applies to other routes using the same host name for that listener? Like, is that something that we're considering acceptable, that this route trusts this gateway and this gateway trusts routes in these 5 namespaces? So therefore, by trusting this gateway, you're also trusting routes in those other namespaces to attach certificates. Is that a trust relationship we're comfortable with? Or do we really need something more than that?
So you mean multiple
Or-
routes, same host, different paths or different header matching rules?
Yeah, so
I guess-
it's go ahead, Bowie.
Yeah, I think like the sort of the question that we hit talking to a few folks is like, there may be some implementations that just flat out say, we don't want to allow this kind of delegation, which I guess you could do with just using OPA or something to zap out the field. For the people who are supporting it, which sounds like you guys have a very clear use case. I guess, Rob, is the question, like, do you guys handle all of these potentially nasty edge cases, and that's okay?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it, but it's also part of it is due to interpretation. When you see a certificate attached on a route, it is only natural to look at that certificate and say, this certificate applies to this route. And so far in our documentation, what we're saying is this certificate is a way to attach a certificate to the gateway listener or listeners that the route is attached to. It's a seemingly small nuance, but what that does is it allows a route to affect TLS on many other routes, potentially in different namespaces, depending on the dynamics of that listener. I think it's much more complicated and or impossible if we were to do the second option of each route has its own TLS certificate that applies only to it. Because then, our translation layer and everything else becomes messy, and I think it has to be an extended feature.
But then that's not technically possible, right? Like TLS session happens before
Right,
HTTP
like
route match.
yeah, so I don't even know that that even makes sense. I guess just clarifying that, is this risk acceptable then? Is the risk that I have a route in namespace A and I can affect these 5 other namespaces because the gateway I'm providing the cert to trusts these other namespaces too? Are we going to have some kind of security issue related to this in the future because we didn't document things clearly enough? We didn't limit the capabilities here clearly enough. I'm not sure. It raises some concerns.
Yeah,
It does complicate. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Micaiah.
Well, it does complicate things, and it does cause a lot of confusion if you define the certificate on a route, and then you have another route, same host name, different path. That's definitely something we've had to deal with, and well, we don't have a good solution for that. The main use case, I mean, it's really about allowing the application developer to supply the certificate. It's not necessarily certificate needs to be closely associated with the route, but more the certificate, it needs to be possible for the person who owns the application behind this route to be able to supply the corresponding certificate.
So if we think about delegating that to a namespace, say you have like your app namespace and you want to delegate app.example.com to that namespace. I think the gateway admin would already need to create a listener for app.example.com. They would then need to say like select the routes in the app namespace so that no one else can just steal the domain. And then today they could either say, I want to use this certificate, or they can say, let the route override. Wouldn't we be able to satisfy the same use case of letting them bring their own certificate if we just instead allowed that certificate reference to cross the namespace boundary as well? And then use like reference policy to allow that binding. So just like we say, we want routes from the app namespace, we also say, hey, we also want this certificate from the app namespace. And the secret itself can live in that namespace, but it's still kind of configured by the gateway admin. And then we avoid a lot of these issues, but still allow kind of the application to own the certificate. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
How does it avoid
I mean,
the issues though?
so one of the things that helps with is the confusion around the potential conflicts. That's what I'll say. So if a listener selects multiple routes and says allow override true, and 3 of those routes provide certs and they're different in any way, or there's some kind of conflict, it gets very messy very quickly. And what you avoid with, if I'm understanding John's suggestion there, it would be a direct reference from gateway to cert. So this unfortunately requires a fair amount of coordination between gateway owner and route admin or app admin, whoever that is. But it does, make that a lot less ambiguous. It's very clear. This cert applies to this listener, and there's no way for multiple certs to be attached to a given listener. It's just, and it still allows that delegation to occur where this can be written by someone in app namespace instead of gateway namespace. So I'm not sure if this solves, and that's why it's helpful to understand the use cases here, because if that solves the use case, that makes everything 1,000 times easier in my mind, but I'm not sure it does. And I guess Micah, you can chime in, or anyone else who's interested in this feature has use cases for it.
I think that would solve the use case. So, right, the application developer would be able to define the route and then define the certificate. They don't need to themselves reference each other, but then the gateway is configured to select secrets and routes from whatever namespace the secret and route are in, right?
Yeah, that's one interpretation of it. The selection actually is maybe that's an interesting way of looking at it. I had in my head thought of it as a direct reference from listener to secret, but a selector would give a little bit more flexibility there.
Okay, well, I was going to say the difficulty if you use a selector is how do you match this route with this secret? You still have the situation where you could have 2 secrets in the same namespace, or maybe even in different namespaces.
Yeah.
Like do the secret and the route have to be in the same namespace? Now, if you use a name, then I understand now that gets into the coordination issue that you're talking about, where whoever manages the gateway has to know what the name for the secret is going to be. Well, you still don't, I guess you still do have that coordination. Your gateway says potentially you have a list of secrets and select some routes using the selector. You still don't have a way to associate this secret with that route, do you?
You would, it's per host name, would be my interpretation. And so in that case, it's not so much associating a certificate with a route, it's associating it with a given host name on a given gateway. And even when you were attaching certificates to routes, the route was just a means of achieving the same end. It was still, I'm attaching, you know, a route, a certificate to this specific host name for this listener.
Okay, now a listener only has one host name, but I guess you can use gateway collapsing, right?
Yeah, a listener only has one host name, and even our examples so far have included the idea of if a listener doesn't specify a host name, it is by definition wildcard. So a listener can have n host names and, you know, infinite host names in that sense. Whether or not that makes sense with this, I'm not sure. I think the more sane configuration is to have multiple per host name listeners that could then be collapsed.
Yeah, the one other use case for this is like, you know, you have star.foo.example.com and star.bar.example.com at the listener level. And then these delegate to two different namespaces, foo and bar. And within those, you have like more specific, like you don't want wildcard certificates. Like that's something that I've heard, like we want name certificates and something like that. So
Yeah.
in that model, you actually don't run into security issues unless you configure the gateway wrong.
To clarify, in that model, you're still providing the certificate with the route.
Correct.
And you don't run into security issues because each listener is constrained to routes in a single namespace.
That's right. And you also have the host name as the filter, right? So let's say I have a namespace Baz, and that can, and the gateway forward star.baz.example.com to that namespace. Now in that namespace, if I specify foo.baz.food or like anything like foobar.foo.example.com, in that case, that route wouldn't be matched, right? Because a route always has to is first filtered by the listener.
Yeah.
So I think I thought someone had a use case where they didn't want that constraint. I don't think we say that the certificate is constrained by the host name, or did we?
To clarify, I don't think we have that language anywhere in here.
I think we chose to, at least the format that we specify things makes it potentially possible to use it as a constraint, but we never went ahead and said that it should be a constraint.
Yeah.
I think we have an open issue where I believe Nick was going to add some language to say that hostname and SNI should be bound.
Okay.
That might resolve some of the dangerousness that of the current stuff.
I mean,
Right.
it still doesn't resolve what I think the point that Rob brings up, that by trusting a gateway or indirectly trusting a namespace as well.
Yeah, I mean, by trusting a gateway, you're trusting all namespaces, all routes and all namespaces that gateway trusts or that gateway listener trusts. And that becomes that is no longer the case if we can pull this concept out of route and into, say, gateway. But then
But
you
I think
require
that's
that.
a interesting boundary because, for instance, at the very least, you could specify that this route namespace can only have foo.com and this route can only have bar.com. Which is different than just people can show up with their certificates and
What?
kind of we don't have any control.
So this route can only have.
People have to coordinate.
Okay, sure. So if we're saying that hostname and SNI have to match, then
Or be in a subset relationship.
sure.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could add some guidance with that, right? Like you specify a more specific wildcard matching, a hostname matching in the listener, and then you allow this feature, right? This feature is opt-in, disabled by default. So in that case, does like the trust problem go away?
Maybe it feels like this requires more thought, at least from me, to properly understand the different risks involved here. All I know is that there are risks involved here. We probably have missed at least one of them. And if there are ways to simplify this or further restrict it, we potentially limit the not attack surface, but yeah, I guess attack surface and complexity of this API. And so trying to find, you know, if we properly understand the use cases for this, we can at least look at alternatives and see if they would fulfill that. Like the alternative of that John mentioned of TLS cert being still being defined referenced from gateway directly, but referencing something like in another namespace.
I think that goes against the self-service. Yeah, but we should investigate it. I feel like if we put this restriction, it does fix a lot of the issues. I just remember there was a conversation where people didn't like this restriction, or they had a use case around this restriction. But if anyone on the call remembers that conversation, maybe it didn't happen.
I think it was more, I'm not certain if I remember that, but we have run into like, I think more liberal use cases where people trust everything in all the namespaces. Maybe that's not a good idea, but that's another model where, you know, one persona controls all of these resources. And so they want to organize these things a little differently, but I'm not sure.
So I think I guess with this discussion, there's it's kind of tricky to keep this discussion on track, right? Because there's different security issues that we're kind of thinking about. So on the serving side, you know, we're thinking about what's like binding a SNI to certificate selection to HTTP host names, and we're trying to make it easy for for operators to get a secure deployment by default, something that won't have you know, domain fronting attacks or surprising configuration results. In the cluster, what the security problem that we're trying to tackle is sort of around privacy of TLS keys and preventing, you know, unexpected access to TLS keys, which would result in them being, you know, exfiltrated or something like that. So we kind of got these two separate problems. And I think if we try to look at them, maybe if we try and look at them in as separate problems rather than like this whole TLS configuration, maybe that's helpful.
That's true. I think is one of the reasons why we some people wanted this to be extensions for the controller necessarily needs to look at all namespaces potentially.
At least for me, you cut out at the end there. I'm not sure, it could have just been me. But the bit I heard at the end was something about the controller needing to support all namespaces for this.
To access all namespaces. Like, let's say it's core, then like the controller must have access to all namespaces to pass conformance.
Not this though. This is saying that if a controller can access a route, surely, okay, so okay, I see. It would need to be able to reference secrets in all namespaces the route was included in. They were supporting routes, and as opposed to just referencing secrets where it supported gateways. Is that the distinction?
Yeah, like maybe we just need to pull, as James said, we need to pull that one out explicitly and just kind of make it so that that is not a strict requirement, which one way is to say it's extended, but another way is to sort of just address it in terms of what the expectation is.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm gonna have to spend some time thinking this one through as far as how we can handle this. It does seem like what we've been discussing here about ensuring that TLS, that hostname and SNI match would help here with the potential risks associated with this. I think part of my rationale for extended was thinking through that this feels like a scary feature, and some implementations may not want to support it because it seems scary. But that is not the bar we have had. You know, if it seems scary, we should probably just not have it in the API, or we should find a way to make it less scary. The requirement that hostname and SNI match may be sufficient. But interested in other ideas here as well. You know, and also interested, you know, I don't think it matches with the bring your own domain kind of use case, the self-service use case. But if we could somehow pull this out and let gateway config be sufficient, that would simplify things as well. Yeah. Okay, well, I know we're at time here. Those are the issues that are not covered by GEPS. I think the last two are pretty straightforward, and this one will require some more work from me. And please take some time to review at least 719 and 725, and hopefully we can get them in really soon. Anything else that I missed? Anyone have any last thoughts? All right. Well, have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.